Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. I'm so thrilled today to be talking to the filmmaker of the movie The Gateway. We have the wonderful Michele Civetta. And I wanted to start by talking about your involvement as a co-writer on the script as well, because when you first came on board on the project, it sounds like there was already a script in progress and that they'd framed a lot of the idea of who these central characters were going to be, and was interested in your collaborative dynamic with the rest of the writing team when you came on board and some of the aspects and places where you really wanted to evolve certain character choices or certain narrative points as you started to think about this from a filmmaking perspective as a director.
That is a nicely packed question. I was given the script by Andrew Levitas, who produced the film, and he also helped to write a bit along the way. And he basically had told me, look, I have a very straightforward kind of inner city crime thriller genre piece. It's very well written. It has all the nuts and bolts that, kind of tell a story comprehensively. But you should basically dig in and kind of really establish a bit of flair and like character dynamics. And so, in essence, I would say I probably rewrote a good, 2/3 of the script in terms of, there was characters who were never in the movie, like the Frank Grillo character. The relationship between Bruce Dern and Shea Wiggum, who plays Parker, was expanded on quite heavily. And so, it was brilliant to find a script that had such good rudimentary building blocks, because like the structure was functioning, in essence, but it was a departure point to, really explore more like socio-political ideas and, get into the nuts and bolts of backstory of characters and figure out really what made this thing, sing in terms of like the human component, like the dynamics of what everyone was kind of interfacing within the community and the story.
Mm-hmm. And with that idea of the human component within the film, you're really interweaving the idea of these very interpersonal character relationships alongside, looking at the world of crime and the interesting way that that actually intersects with social work, which is kind of an unexpected space to explore. And so when you were thinking about the way in which you wanted to approach the story and the type of dialogue that you wanted to create, how did you think about the way in which you were going to balance these almost two very different tones of the film with the intimacy and then with the crime side and what they both ask of you?
Well, like we were just saying, Mara, I felt like, it was in essence the building blocks of like what a noir is. And neo-noirs are great at finding like a way to really express very complicated ideas without having to make a whole movie about them, in the sense that I like to imagine this as a bit of a tapestry piece. So it's like you had the ability to, dig in and kind of just say, okay, the crime boss is, also involved in issues revolving like the drug trafficking and just kind of like the fallout of what that means on like a political scale. So it's like you had the ability, I think, in these types of stories to delve deeper than in like what the real kind of like cookie cutter formulation of, a crime thriller is. And so with that said, it was a lot of fun to, discover these things and really find out what's human there, because that's really what makes movies sing, is the ability for us to project something in our own minds and ideas that like we relate to,
Yeah. And is that idea behind the noir sensibility also what led to a lot of the visual aesthetic choices? Because particularly when we look at moments like the scene in the bar, or there's a really intricate robbery scene, there's a lot of use of not just low lighting, but thinking about the color palettes and very much creating a certain sensibility in terms of mood as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it became real important to my cinematographer, Brian Newman, and myself, and our production designer, Michael Fitzpatrick, early on, to establish color tones and color schemes for different characters, because it becomes the kind of like the subconscious motifs that allow you to be aware of where you're at in a story moving forward. With that said, noir and the nuances of that really give you an amazing opportunity, I think, to kind of delve a little deeper in terms of the expressionism and just, what you can create in terms of lighting schematics and stuff. I'm a big fan of a lot of the 70s kind of work, John Cassavetes, whether it's Killing of the Chinese Bookie or John Huston's Fat City. And, they take a lot of risks in terms of what realism is. And simultaneously with that, you have the ability to have forms of fantasy in there that kind of allow you to maintain a balance in the story, but also delve to some place that, is a little bit more fantastical in some senses. In the case of the robbery sequence, we wanted it to be visceral, but at the same time, hallucinatory.
And did you have any moment where you went back and forth in the robbery shooting in terms of how much you wanted to show in terms of the violence? Because the scene overall is not violent at every single turn, but there are one or two moments where the camera really hones in and doesn't shy away from what we're seeing on screen at the same time.
I always think that, unless violence is being inflicted upon you, it tends to be something that you don't really see it. It kind of lurks out of the corner of your eye. And so it's the sense of impending violence and danger is many times much more terrifying than actually just seeing, someone get shot in your face. So it was kind of important, I think, in that sequence to really build up the nuances of what that place was, like almost like it was a Minotaur's labyrinth, that you worked your way through it and you're like, oh man, like who might be behind this corner? And like such that when you finally get to the end juncture, there's some violence and blood and stuff. But if it was all just straight up shoot, bang, bang, I don't think it would be quite as scary. I mean, that's the essence of what you look for, I think, in suspense,
Yeah. And you were bringing up Shea Wiggum, who plays the central role of Parker in the film earlier.
Yeah.
And was interested in talking about that character a little bit, because the way in which you've approached it, he's not just a character who's dealing with everything in his life at the moment, but through the use of certain things such as flashback scenes that we see to his childhood, we also get this essence of him being a character who's still trying to heal the child inside of himself. And so was it always clear to you that you wanted to use tools like having those flashback moments in order to really explore the internal journey that he's going on with himself as well as the external side of him?
That's a great question, I got to say, because it was a real kind of like paradoxical question. Like, is this going to work? Is this, fair in terms of the scope of filmmaking? And, in essence, I mean, to portray like the inner life of the character or their subconscious is not the easiest facet in filmmaking. I mean, certainly if you go back to like surrealist filmmaking, you have a tradition where you can go inside of characters' minds and dream spaces and things like that. So, in this case, I felt like we could go a little bit impressionistic with that stuff, simply because he's such a riddle as a character. I mean, he, as you pointed out, is really both struggling to understand his past and in that find some sort of road towards redemption in terms of who he is. And one of the things that Shea so keenly created as a credo for the Parker character when we first started digging in was that he's a guy who can't take care of himself, but he takes care of others. And so, wearing that on his sleeve became really the way that you got to track this character and his conflicts, in terms of how he's kind of coming to grips with his own life, but he's kind of unaware and really still processing, whether it's past traumas or the inability to connect on the human level with the people he really needs to reach out to, in this case, his dad.
Yeah. And it's not just his character's relationship with his dad. There's a real theme throughout the film about relationships between parents and children. We see Dahlia, Olivia Munn's character, and her daughter, and that relationship explored. There's another young boy in the film that Parker's helping as a social worker. And so there's really all these different dynamics that are looking at characters in terms of how they're both a product of circumstance, but also the choices that they choose to make for themselves, and really leaning into the gray area. And so how did you want to set about exploring that dynamic and how our parents inform who we are, but also free will and free choice at the same time in who we become to a degree as well?
Well, I mean, it's, the story really does hone in on these questions of nature versus nurture, that, no one is capable of deciding, their birthright, and, who you become along the way can be as subject to a great mentor or a great friend along the way. In the instance of this film, I think a lot of these characters are deeply flawed, and they're struggling with their own sense of morality. And with that in mind, I think they're really trying to come to grips with their own past. And so, what I love about noir stories is they don't really exist it all exists in shades of gray. So nobody's entirely, bad or good. But the definition of the characters always lies in that gray zone in between, you know. So it's like you could say a lot of these characters are anti-heroes, or are they, you know, good guys in a bad guys movie. It's like really the complexity is almost left for someone watching it to make these decisions.
Yeah. And when you have scenes where you do have these kids and we're looking at their lives and how they're being impacted by parents and adults around them, it also really feels like we are getting that perspective. It's not that there's just a kid that we're seeing being taken out of his home and come into a foster home for the first time. We're really seeing and understanding what that feels like from his experience. And similarly with the character of Dahlia's daughter as well, we get the essence of what her experience through all of this is. So when you were shooting a lot of those scenes, how did that inform the way that you were thinking, particularly in terms of camera setup and visual storytelling, and how you wanted to make sure that you captured that perspective as well?
I mean, there's a couple tones within the let's just call it like the children's storylines. One is a little bit more fantastical because it exists in the realm of where Parker kind of exists and interfaces with the Tommy child, and I think it has a lot more to do with his lost childhood, whereas, you know, in terms of stylistically and you know, from a camera standpoint, we wanted to keep everything with Tegan Burns, who's just one heck of a young actress, who plays Ashley, just really kind of visceral in the room. And so you felt like it was more fly on the wall in terms of the type of realism that we were trying to at least discover, you know?
And in working with the cast that you have casts that work in all sorts of different ways. You're working with child actors, you're working with Bruce Dern, who's been in the industry for so long and comes in with such a different dynamic and scene approach, I imagine, to some of the other performers. And so as a director on this particular project, what were some of the ways in which you found yourself really listening, paying attention, keying into what each performer needed from you individually, and really making sure that you were creating the space that all of them required from you?
I mean, that's a really, really fascinating question, because, you know, every actor really comes at their craft from such a different tactical standpoint, you know, like in the sense that, you know, one might be more attuned to character development based upon previous occurrences in their life. And so like, that's always becoming part of what you discuss, whereas others, you know, maybe are more method. And with someone like Bruce, what was so fascinating, because he obviously has been in dozens and dozens of great films over the years, he asked me one thing from the get-go, which was the gift of spontaneity. Like, we can talk about the character, we can talk about the scope of story, but when the camera rolls, like I've got to give it to you the way I see it at first. And what it in fact does, and it's miraculous, because I feel like if something gets too rehearsed or too dramaturgical after a point, you lose that kind of fusion or flair that allows you to be truly creative in the way we are in life. Like when somebody comes in the room and starts yelling at you, you're not expecting that necessarily. And Bruce had the ability to knock scenes off balance. And, you know, that's where it becomes incredibly volatile in terms of what's being created, you know, because it becomes reactive rather than preordained or pre-organized or something, you know? So, you know, every single actor has their own unique tricks in terms of how they approach stuff. But what I was aiming to achieve with everyone was really just like a fusion where you find elements of truth in terms of how scenes play out.
When you were having conversations, even before shooting with a lot of the cast, what were some of the certain details or themes and ways that you wanted them to think about the story in beyond the pages of the script that they had, you know, really working between the pages of dialogue and between the character beats that they had on paper? You know, what were those details that were the most important for you to convey and communicate to them?
Without a doubt, I mean, there's so many characters in this movie, but just to find real elements of truth that kind of became core character dynamics. So like Olivia Munn was terrific, you know, from the get-go in our first conversation. She found ways to relate the Dahlia character to her own life, in terms of, you know, oh, I was one of the kids who couldn't go to the cafeteria and necessarily buy lunch that day. So I'd always bring in a bagged lunch, and I kind of felt a little embarrassed. So I'd have to, you know, take it out and not let the other kids see me. That's, you know, something that's almost like sense memory in terms of building something that's so palpable. If somebody knows that feeling and that expression, you take that into the character. And so that character work, a lot of that is partially conversational based, in the process of preparing a script and talking with everyone. But it's the triggers that really allow, I believe, actors to hook into the dynamic of the places they go when they're working.
Yeah. And we were talking a little bit earlier about one of the scenes in the movie, which is a robbery and has all these kind of very in-depth tracking shots that are really carrying us through the motion. And then later in the film, there's a shootout scene as well, which is requiring some of a similar scope of storytelling, but also is very different because there's a different type of intimacy with the characters that we're following. And yet both of them also really utilize every single corner of a location. The one later in the movie, we're in a house and we're going into every single corner, every single crevice. We're going upstairs, we're going downstairs, we're going out the back, we're going around the front. And so, given how intricate it is, but how you still always wanted to root it in these characters and telling a story about them and their journey that they're on at that moment. What was that process of really figuring out the tracking shots, the camera movements, and really blocking it out with the actors, but making sure that it always came back to those character beats?
I mean, in the instance of the heist scene, that's something I kind of considered a set piece in the sense that it's a bit of a reprieve for the story, but I mean, it basically kicks a lot of the suspense and the whole story into gear and stuff. So with that one, it was intricate only in the sense that we wanted to really, really build it in a way that it felt like one take basically all the way through. So there was a lot of pre-blocking involved with the actors who actually did the heist, and with our stunt coordinator along the way. So that sequence actually took us 3 days to shoot, if you can imagine. And whereas the ending one, I think, was only a day because it's much more in your face, kind of just like more guttural filmmaking. I mean, it really is just like raw. Like, I mean, I didn't want that to feel polished, and it seemed like it just had to somehow maintain, like you pointed out earlier, that dramatic component that you're with the characters, with the story, but you're not too far away or getting swept away with, elaborate camera motions or anything like that. It was just more, kind of fly on the wall storytelling.
Yeah. And there's a lot of moments throughout the film and a lot of repercussions to things that happen in a certain way because of the system. And there's a real dialogue around the social care system, the people that work in it, and having the best of intentions, but how at the end of the day, the system falls short in a lot of ways. So even with the best of intentions, you can't always do everything the way that you want to or need to be able to in order to best support families. And so what was that type of dialogue and conversation that you really wanted to elicit from audiences in the way that you approach that thematically?
In many ways, it comes back to some of the dialogue I wrote for Frank Grillo, in the sense that America's at a crossroads. It has an identity crisis. And I think that, what is at root at this point is we've lost the ability to necessarily keep track of the vital kind of human components in our society. So, the fact that there's so many children enmeshed in the social welfare system who are not actually being taken care of, and it's really kind of an abject failure on the part of the society on a whole. And obviously, you can't fix everything, but it's no different than, say, like the homeless crisis that's going on after the pandemic and stuff. It's just intrinsically a failure in terms of human rights. I mean, I think that we as a community owe everybody else who we live with the benefit of looking after each other, because that's going to be the next road in the future, and very much so in theme with these younger kids ultimately in the story. It's like those are going to be the ones who are going to be ruling the world someday. So.
Yeah. And because of everything that you're exploring in the film, both thematically, tonally, in terms of the shifts in different types of pacing for different beats within the story, when it came to post-production and editing, was it a fairly easy path to find all the different rhythms and beats as you were putting together the film? Or was it a lot of having, based on that response, I'm going to say it was a lot of playing around with scenes and really kind of figuring out what worked for each individual moment?
That's super succinct, because, we've been saying in this type of story, I mean, it's technically about 3 or 4 different types of movies rolled into one tonally. And I was super fortunate in the editing process. I got to work with a gal named Susie Almager, and Susie had cut her teeth with kind of the last phase of Robert Altman movies, like I think starting on The Player, working her way through. And he was kind of the ultimate improvisational director. So it's like he would shoot movies that ended up being close to 3 hours, but the first cut was 9 hours, you know? And so it was, she explained it as a path of, you know, you're basically adding by subtracting. You know, you're actually finding the core of how everything works by just cutting away, you know, like a gigantic marble slab to create your sculpture at the end. Within this, I mean, the movie was probably initially about another half hour longer. And so there was different dynamics that came into play. And, you know, once you really carved it down to its essence, it seemed like it was almost like finding a mathematical formula that just hung in a balance. Like if you have enough of this part, like say A storyline, then the B will somehow balance out and you can come into that, but you're still, you know, reticent. Go back to A, B makes sense, C makes sense. And they just kind of continue interweaving, but it's not an easy battle. I didn't find it an easy battle at least. So.
Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing all of this with the film, and congratulations on everything that you, the rest of the cast and crew, achieved with this. Thank you so much, Michele.
Oh, thank you so much, Mara. I had a real pleasure talking together today. Thank you for all the great questions, and look forward to talking again.